The cafeteria at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland, had long been a site of productive shop talk between the physicists, technicians, mathematicians, and proto-hackers who worked there. But the Monday lunchtime chatter on October 7, 1957, was unusually heated, thanks to the weekend headlines announcing the Soviet launch of Sputnik 1, the first man-made Earth-orbiting satellite. Two young physicists, William Guier and George Weiffenbach, found themselves in a spirited discussion about the microwave signals that would likely be emanating from Sputnik. After canvassing some of their colleagues, it appeared that no one had bothered to come in over the weekend to see if Sputnik signals could be picked up by the APL's equipment. Weiffenbach, as it turned out, was in the middle of a PhD on microwave spectroscopy and had a 20 megahertz receiver sitting in his office. Guier and Weiffenbach spent the afternoon hunched over the receiver, listening for the Sputnik's audio fingerprint. To combat the doubters, who would inevitably question whether the whole launch was an elaborate hoax, a product of communist propaganda, the Soviets had engineered Sputnik so that it would transmit an unusually accessible signal, an unbroken tone broadcast within 1 kilohertz of 20 megahertz. By the end of the afternoon, Weiffenbach and Guier had a clear lock on it. The sound itself was a staccato pulse of electronic bleeps, but context transformed it into the most marvelous music the two men had ever heard. It seemed unbelievable, sitting in a room in suburban Maryland, listening to man-made signals coming from space. Word began to spread through the APL that the young physicists had captured Sputnik's signal, and a steady stream of visitors appeared at Weiffenbach's door to eavesdrop on the satellite's orbit. Realizing that they were listening to history, Guier and Weiffenbach hooked up the receiver to an audio amplifier and began recording the signal on audio tape. They included timestamps with each recording. As they listened and recorded, the two men realized that they could use the Doppler effect to calculate the speed at which the satellite was moving through space. Because Sputnik was emitting a signal at a steady frequency, and because the microwave receiver was stationary, Guier and Weiffenbach realized that they could calculate the movement of the satellite based on the small but steady changes in the waveform they were capturing. Late that night, they remembered an additional mathematical trick. By analyzing the slope of the Doppler shift, they could determine the point in Sputnik's orbit that was closest to the APL laboratories. Almost by accident, they had hit upon a technique not just for calculating the satellite's speed, but for actually mapping the trajectory of its orbit. In a matter of hours, the two young scientists had gone from listening to measuring to tracking the Russian satellite. Over the subsequent weeks, a loose network of scientists at APL coalesced around Guier and Weiffenbach's hunch, filling in details, researching the theoretical literature on orbiting bodies, and proposing technology improvements. Eventually, the APL's director approved funds to run the numbers on the lab's new UNIVAC computer. Within a few months of that first transmission, they had a complete description of Sputnik's orbit, inferred entirely from that simple 20 megahertz signal. In the spring of 1958, Frank T. McClure, the legendary deputy director of the Applied Physics Laboratory, called Guier and Weiffenbach into his office. McClure had a confidential question to ask the men. If you could use the known location of a receiver on the ground to calculate the location of a satellite, McClure asked, could you reverse the problem? Could you calculate the location of a receiver on the ground if you knew the exact orbit of the satellite? The project was dubbed the Transit System. Just 3 years after Sputnik's launch, there were 5 U.S. satellites in orbit, providing navigational data to the military. When Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down in 1983 after drifting into Soviet airspace thanks to faulty ground-based navigation beacons, Ronald Reagan declared that satellite-based navigation should be a common good, open to civilian use. Around that time, the system took on its current name, Global Positioning System, or GPS. Half a century later, roughly 30 GPS satellites blanket the Earth with navigational signals, providing guidance for everything from mobile phones to digital cameras to Airbus A380s. 50 years later, the same system would help teenagers to play elaborate games in urban centers, or climbers to explore treacherous mountain ranges, or photographers to upload their photos to Flickr maps.